The year 1368 brought a fragile kind of hope to France. Only 2 decades earlier, the Black Death had carved its way across Europe, erasing villages, hollowing cities, and leaving even kings trembling before invisible forces. The 100 Years' War with England had already dragged on for more than 30 years, its rhythm of invasion, rebellion, and ransom pressing down on every peasant and noble alike. Yet in Paris, within the walls of the newly fortified Louvre, there was celebration. The birth of a son to King Charles V of France and Queen Joanna of Bourbon. That child was Charles, destined to inherit one of Europe's greatest crowns and to carry one of his darkest legacies. Charles V, known as the Wise, was no warrior king. He had inherited a battered kingdom from his father John II, who had been captured by the English at Poitiers and held for ransom. Charles V preferred books to swords, negotiation to bloodshed. His court became a place of scholarship, filled with manuscripts copied from across Christendom. Maps were drawn, chronicles compiled, and philosophy debated in chambers lit by beeswax candles. His son, the infant Charles, grew up not in the clamor of tournaments, but in the whispers of scholars. The boy's cradle stood beneath painted ceilings of gold and azure. Courtiers who saw him spoke of wide eyes, watchful and serious, as if the weight of inheritance had pressed into him before he could even walk. He was the 4th of 12 children, but the first son to survive infancy. From the beginning, France's fragile hopes were pinned to him. Tutors were summoned from Italy and Flanders, men who taught him Latin, theology, and the language of statecraft. They told him stories of Charlemagne and St. Louis, of kings who had led France not only to victory, but to holiness. Yet shadows lingered in the palace. His mother Joanna descended into bouts of instability, withdrawn from courtly life, prone to long silences that unsettled her attendants. Her bloodline carried whispers of madness. Her sister, Margaret of Bourbon, had also shown signs of unsteady mind. Such things were not spoken openly. Mental illness had no language then, only the vague murmurs of possession, melancholy, or divine punishment. Still, in the eyes of chroniclers centuries later, the inheritance was clear. Charles VI's destiny was already inked in his veins. Outside the Louvre, Paris pulsed with contradictions. Merchants crowded the narrow streets, selling spices, tapestries, and relics to pilgrims. Bells of Notre Dame tolled across the Seine, their iron voices clashing with the shouts of beggars. Yet the city was restless. Heavy taxation to fund the endless war had bred resentment. In the taverns, rumors festered of nobles who lived richly while peasants starved, of English ships prowling the coast, of Burgundian dukes whose wealth rivaled the crown's. For the boy Charles, these tensions were muffled. His world was one of ritual and ceremony. He learned to kneel before relics, to hold a sword with the gesture of a king, to ride a pony through gardens walled with roses. Chroniclers describe him as gentle and bright, with a face framed by the long Valois nose and large, solemn eyes. To courtiers, he seemed the promise of renewal after years of defeat and plague. But even in childhood, there were signs of fragility. Servants later recalled that Charles was easily startled, retreating into silence when voices rose around him. He preferred the company of books and music to the clamor of mock battles staged for him in the courtyard. His father, Charles V, worried aloud that the boy lacked the steel of a ruler. Yet he also recognized something else, a sensitivity, almost prophetic, that might serve him as well as strength of arms. In 1380, when Charles was only 11, the golden walls of his childhood cracked. His father, Charles V, lay dying. Disease had hollowed him, leaving the once scholarly king a husk. Chroniclers say he called his son to his bedside, placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder, and urged him to trust wise counselors, to be a shepherd of his people rather than a tyrant. Then, with the tolling of the palace bells, the wise king was gone. The Louvre fell into mourning. Courtiers donned black. Prayers echoed through the chapels. Outside, the streets of Paris seethed with a more dangerous grief. People feared not only the death of their king, but the uncertainty of a child ruler. In such times, power rarely flowed to the rightful heir. It pooled around ambitious men eager to seize the regency. Charles VI, not yet a teenager, was crowned at Reims Cathedral. The anointing oil shimmered on his young brow, the crown of St. Louis resting heavy on his small head. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the wind, and chroniclers noted the innocence in his face as he gazed out over the assembled lords. To the people, the sight of a child king was both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful, because he was untainted by the corruptions of his elders. Terrifying, because a child could be molded, manipulated, and broken. As the ceremony ended and the boy returned to Paris, whispers began to ripple through the court. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Bourbon, had already positioned themselves as guardians of the realm. They spoke of protecting the boy's interests, but everyone knew their true intention: to wield the crown's power for themselves. The child's reign had begun, but the kingdom was no longer his to command. And yet, in those early years, chroniclers still wrote of promise. They called him the Flower of France, a boy destined to heal the wounds of plague and war. Few could imagine that within a generation, he would be remembered not as the beloved king, but as the king of glass, fragile, fractured, and forever haunted by the shadows already stirring within him. When the bells of Reims fell silent in November 1380, France officially had a king. But at just 11 years old, Charles VI could not truly reign. His crown gleamed upon his brow, yet it weighed more heavily on the shoulders of others, his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Bourbon, and Anjou. They gathered around him like vultures around a lamb, cloaking their ambition in the language of guardianship. France in 1380 was a fractured land. The 100 Years' War had left scars that were still raw. Whole regions had been pillaged by mercenary bands who wandered the countryside in the lulls between campaigns. The plague had not vanished, only retreated into dormancy, flaring up to remind everyone of death's shadow. And now, after the long, scholarly reign of Charles V, the sudden appearance of a boy king fed both fear and greed. The boy himself seemed too fragile for the storm. Courtiers remembered him in those years as wide-eyed, easily unsettled by the quarrels of adults. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was in soft tones, as though afraid of his own voice. One chronicler, the monk Michel Pentoin, noted that Charles often stood apart at ceremonies, looking as though he belonged to some other world, but his uncles belonged very much to this one. Each of them saw in the boy's crown an opportunity. Louis of Anjou sought resources to pursue claims in Naples. John of Berry coveted wealth to fund his extravagant patronage of the arts. And Philip the Bold of Burgundy, perhaps the shrewdest of them all, aimed to make the Burgundian state into a rival power, stretching from Flanders to the Swiss Alps. It was Philip who quickly emerged as the most influential. Married into the Duchy of Flanders, he commanded immense wealth and military power. While Charles VI played with tutors in the palace gardens, Philip orchestrated policies that enriched himself and his allies. Taxes were raised to fund his ambitions, offices were sold, debts multiplied. The people of Paris did not take this quietly. In March 1382, fury boiled into open revolt. Armed with iron mallets, citizens surged through the streets, attacking officials and tax collectors. Chroniclers called them the Maillotins, the Hammermen. Bells rang, barricades rose, and for days Paris was in chaos. The boy king was rushed into safety while his uncles debated how to crush the uprising. When royal forces finally restored order, the reprisals were brutal. Executions in the squares, bodies hanging from bridges, entire neighborhoods punished with new levies. To the people, the image was clear. The king was a child, invisible behind palace walls. His uncles were parasites, bleeding the realm. Whispers began that the Valois crown itself had lost its sacred power, that perhaps God no longer favored France. For Charles, the revolt left an indelible mark. Though sheltered from its violence, he absorbed the tension like smoke seeping under a door. Servants later claimed the boy grew nervous in crowds, suspicious of sudden noises, as though the echo of hammers striking stone haunted him. At feasts, he sometimes stared at the great chandeliers as if they might shatter above him. No one thought much of it at the time. A sensitive boy, they said, overly pious, easily startled. But in hindsight, the signs of fragility were already there. Amid this turmoil, France still tried to maintain its ceremonies. The young king rode in processions, dressed in silks that weighed almost as much as his frame. He knelt before relics, accepted oaths of homage, and signed decrees prepared by others. Chroniclers described him as graceful in appearance, with delicate hands, and a solemn dignity unusual for his age. People wanted to believe in him, even as the reality of his powerlessness was obvious. The greatest display came in 1385, when Charles was married. His bride was Isabeau of Bavaria, daughter of Duke Stephen of Bavaria-Ingolstadt. She was only about 15, still more girl than woman, but her marriage was engineered to strengthen French alliances in the ever-shifting landscape of European politics. The wedding in Amiens was magnificent. Jewels, feasts, music that spilled into the streets. Charles, now 17, was said to have looked at her with genuine affection. For a moment, Paris rejoiced. A young king with a young queen, perhaps this meant stability, renewal, the promise of heirs. Yet the old powers did not yield. Philip of Burgundy continued to dominate the council, and Isabeau herself soon became a political pawn, manipulated by whichever faction held influence. Charles, though older, remained hesitant to assert himself. He vacillated between bursts of determination and stretches of passivity, as though the act of ruling itself drained him. In 1388, however, a turning point arrived. Charles, now 20, announced that he would finally govern on his own. He dismissed his uncles and restored his father's former ministers, known as the Marmosets. These were men of experience, loyal to Charles V's legacy, who favored reform over personal enrichment. For a brief time, hope flared. Taxes were reduced, corruption checked, and even the English conflict cooled. Chroniclers record that the people began calling him Charles Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. For a nation long exhausted by war and misrule, the image of a just young king seemed almost miraculous. Crowds cheered when he rode through Paris, and ballads were sung in his honor. His reign, it seemed, had truly begun, and yet beneath the pageantry and reforms, cracks remained. The boy who had grown up in golden chambers was still haunted by shadows. He had inherited not only a kingdom of fractures, but perhaps a mind inclined to fracture as well. His mother's melancholy, his own nervous silences, the weight of expectation, it all lingered, invisible but present. For now, no one noticed. For now, Charles VI was beloved, but history would remember him differently. The kingdom believed it had found stability. What it had really found was a glass foundation, clear, shining, and destined to shatter. In 1388, the boy became a king in truth. Charles VI, now 20 years old, stood before his court and declared that he no longer needed guardians. His uncles, who had wielded power like puppeteers since his childhood, were dismissed. In their place, Charles summoned back the Marmosets, the seasoned ministers who had once served his father, Charles V. With this single decision, he transformed the atmosphere of France. For the first time since his coronation, hope seemed to glimmer in the air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The change was immediate and dramatic. Taxes that had strangled towns and villages were eased. Corruption, which had seeped through every corner of government under the influence of greedy dukes, was checked. Laws were enforced with greater fairness, and trade began to revive. The people of Paris, long resentful of the royal household, began to cheer when the king passed through the streets. Chroniclers wrote that the people loved him as they had loved no king before, and so a new name entered the chronicles, Charles Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. It was more than good governance. Charles himself radiated the promise of renewal. Tall and slender, with a pale face and thoughtful eyes, he looked every inch the image of a young monarch. At feasts, he was gracious. At councils, he listened with genuine care. He seemed determined to embody the lessons his father had left him, to rule not as a tyrant, but as a steward. Even his marriage to Isabeau of Bavaria began to bear fruit. Their union had been a political arrangement, but by the late 1382, the couple seemed genuinely affectionate. Isabeau, with her dark eyes and strong will, balanced Charles's gentler temperament. They became symbols of youth and vitality at court, hosting grand tournaments and festivals that dazzled nobles and commoners alike. Paris was treated to pageants of color and light knights, in polished armor jousting for honor, minstrels singing of heroic love, tapestries unfurled across palace walls. One account tells of a feast in the Hotel Saint-Paul where Charles appeared in robes embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, Isabeau beside him in a gown of silver silk. The hall shimmered with candlelight reflected in polished goblets, and the people of Paris pressed into the streets outside just to glimpse their king and queen. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it felt as though France's long nightmare of plague and war might finally yield to a golden age. But beneath this brightness lay fragile foundations. Charles's reforms depended on the careful guidance of the Marmosets, and their enemies, the dismissed dukes, waited for their chance to return. Moreover, the young king's sensitivity, once dismissed as shyness, sometimes surfaced in disquieting ways. Those closest to him noticed that he grew restless in crowded halls, sometimes staring into space as if listening to voices no one else could hear. On certain nights, attendants found him pacing the palace corridors long after midnight, murmuring to himself. Still, such moments were easily overlooked. Every ruler carried quirks, and Charles had not yet given reason for alarm. To the majority of his subjects, he was the embodiment of justice and mercy. He personally pardoned debtors, offered relief to famine-stricken provinces, and ensured fair hearings for disputes. These gestures, though modest in the grand scheme of governance, made a profound impression on a weary populace. Beyond the court, however, the world was not at peace. England remained a looming threat, its young king Richard II seeking opportunities to press his claim. Mercenary companies still roamed the countryside, preying upon villages between campaigns. And within France itself, the great dukes still schemed, their ambitions only temporarily checked by Charles's newfound independence. The Marmousets urged Charles to tread carefully. They reminded him of the delicate balance between royal authority and noble power. Charles nodded, agreed, and for the most part listened. Yet he also displayed flashes of youthful confidence, some said arrogance. In council, he sometimes dismissed concerns with a wave of his hand, insisting that God had chosen him to heal France. In private, he reportedly told Isabeau that the crown felt less like a burden than a destiny. To the chroniclers, such words only confirmed the vision of Charles as a ruler anointed by heaven. They compared him to St. Louis, to Charlemagne, to David of the Old Testament. The glow around his name brightened. In 1390, he led a small campaign into Flanders, asserting royal authority with unexpected vigor. Though not a great military endeavor, it demonstrated that Charles could be more than a figurehead, that he could act, and act decisively when needed. Yet there were whispers, even then small, quiet, and easily dismissed. Some courtiers muttered that the king's intensity could turn unsettling. He would fix his gaze too long on a single object, as if entranced. He sometimes spoke with sudden bursts of fervor, then fell into long silences. These were seen as eccentricities, perhaps even signs of divine inspiration, but later generations, looking back, would recognize them as cracks in the glass. For the moment though, Charles VI was the beloved king, and France clung to him as a drowning man clings to driftwood. After decades of war, plague, and regency corruption, the people needed to believe in their sovereign. They filled the streets with songs in his honor. Ballads described him as a healing light, a young star rising in a sky long clouded with darkness. But history has a cruel rhythm. Just as the kingdom began to trust again, fate prepared to intervene. In the summer of 1392, Charles VI would mount his horse for what seemed a routine military expedition. He would ride into a forest, surrounded by loyal men, and there, something in his mind would shatter, sudden, violent, and irreversible. For now, he was still Charles the Beloved. Soon, he would be Charles the Mad. The summer of 1392 was warm and restless. France, despite the brief stability of Charles VI's early rule, remained a land of simmering conflicts. That year, the king's closest advisor and friend, Olivier de Clisson, the Constable of France, was nearly assassinated by an ally of the Duke of Brittany. The attempt on Clisson's life shocked Charles, who had grown to depend on the constable's loyalty. When the would-be murderer fled to Brittany, Charles's council debated retaliation. Many counseled patience, but Charles, outraged and eager to prove his authority, insisted on a swift, punitive campaign. So it was that in August, the king set out from Le Mans at the head of a small army. Chroniclers record that the day was stiflingly hot, the roads dusty, the air thick with tension. Charles rode in full armor despite the heat, surrounded by his knights. He was young, just 24, and determined to show strength. But beneath his composure, something unstable was stirring. As they entered a forest near Le Mans, the silence of the trees pressed heavily around them. Cicadas whined, horses snorted, and the metallic rattle of armor echoed through the stillness. Then, without warning, a ragged man, some say a leper, others a mad beggar, rushed from the roadside, seizing the king's bridle. His voice cracked through the air. "Turn back, noble king. Do not ride further, for betrayal awaits you." Guards seized him instantly, dragging him aside. Charles, shaken, demanded the man be released. "He is mad," the king murmured. "It means no harm." But the words lingered like a curse lodged in the branches above. They pressed onward. The heat intensified, and Charles grew restless. Sweat slicked his skin beneath the armor, and his face flushed. Those riding closest later said his eyes seemed unfocused, darting as though he saw shapes others could not. The company tried to lighten the mood. One squire carried a spear adorned with the king's crest, and the men teased him, laughing, until another struck the shaft playfully. The clash of metal rang out sharp and sudden. Something inside the king broke. Charles's expression hardened, his pupils narrowing to pinpricks. Without a word, he drew his sword. Before anyone could react, he spurred his horse and swung wildly at the nearest knight. Steel bit into flesh. The forest erupted with shouts. Horses reared. Men scrambled to restrain him, but Charles had already struck again, then again, cutting down those who only moments earlier had ridden at his side as loyal companions. Chroniclers describe the scene with horror. The king screamed that traitors surrounded him, that enemies sought to murder him, that he alone must purge them. His blows were frantic, fueled not by strategy, but by frenzy. When his sword glanced off armor, he struck again, heedless of blood spattering his face. One knight fell dead, another maimed. Panic surged through the company. How could they defend themselves against their sovereign? None dared raise a weapon against him, for to harm the king was treason. At last, a quick-thinking chamberlain leapt forward, seizing Charles from behind. Others rushed in, wrenching the sword from his hand. He fought them like a man possessed, screaming incoherently, until sheer exhaustion dragged him into collapse. His body went limp, his eyes staring blankly at the canopy of leaves above. The forest, moments ago filled with carnage, fell into a stunned silence broken only by the moans of the wounded. The survivors looked at one another in disbelief. Their king, the beloved, had murdered his own men in a fit of madness. Blood stained his armor, spattered his horse. The image was too terrible to comprehend. They carried him back to Le Mans, unconscious, his face pale as death. When he awoke hours later, he seemed dazed, with no memory of what had occurred. "Where are my knights?" he asked softly. No one dared answer. News of the episode raced across France. At first, many refused to believe it. The young king, so beloved, so just how could he turn his sword on his friends? But as the accounts multiplied, horror turned to dread. The whispers grew. Their king was cursed, stricken by madness. Some called it divine punishment, others the work of sorcery. Whatever the cause, it marked the beginning of a terrifying pattern. For Charles himself, the episode was both a rupture and a prophecy. He had crossed a threshold. What had once been dismissed as sensitivity, eccentricity, or youthful melancholy now revealed itself as something darker, an affliction that would never leave him. In the months to come, the outbursts will return, sometimes violent, sometimes pitiful, always unpredictable. But on that day in the forest, everything changed. The beloved king who had offered hope became the mad king who inspired fear. His subjects would remember the image of their sovereign bathed in his own knight's blood, eyes wild, convinced of betrayal in the loyal faces around him. It was a vision that could not be undone. Later, chroniclers would look back and see in that moment the true beginning of his downfall. France had believed it was ruled by a golden heir, a young monarch destined to restore greatness. Instead, it found itself bound to a fragile soul who could shatter without warning, a king made of glass. The incident in the forest was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Charles VI fell deeper into something neither his ministers nor his physicians could explain. His moments of clarity became shorter, his lapses longer and more terrifying. Sometimes he would awaken in the night, drenched in sweat, insisting that assassins lurked outside his chamber. Other times, he failed to recognize even his closest attendants. On more than one occasion, he forgot who he was altogether. "I am not your king," he told courtiers in a trembling voice. "I am but a poor knight lost in this place." The court, once glittering with feasts and festivals, grew hushed and tense. Nobles tiptoed through the corridors of the Hotel Saint-Paul, waiting for news of the king's state each morning. Would today bring lucidity or frenzy? Physicians applied leeches, burned herbs, and muttered prayers, but nothing stemmed the tide. Chroniclers describe one particularly harrowing episode when Charles, upon waking, failed to recognize his wife, Isabeau. He pushed her away, eyes wide with terror, shouting that she was an impostor sent to ensnare him. For days after, he refused to let her near, leaving the young queen humiliated before the entire court. It was during these years that the most peculiar of his delusions emerged, the belief that his body was made of glass. He began to insist that even the lightest touch might cause him to shatter into pieces. Terrified of breaking, he forbade anyone to approach him suddenly. He ordered special garments sewn with iron supports to strengthen his fragile frame. Servants recalled that he would sit motionless for hours, afraid that a careless movement might splinter his bones. At night, he sometimes cried out for guards to shield him from collision, convinced that even a stumble in the dark would reduce him to shards. This strange affliction later came to be known by scholars as the glass delusion. But at the time, it was simply another layer of horror. Courtiers whispered that their king had lost his soul, that he was a shell, fragile and hollow. In the streets of Paris, satirical songs began to circulate. Where once Charles had been called bien-aimé, now he was murmured about as Le Roi Fou, the mad king. The psychological terror of these years extended beyond the king himself. His madness left a void at the heart of the kingdom. Authority ebbed and flowed depending on his condition. On days of clarity, Charles signed decrees, spoke with ministers, even smiled at his children. But on days of madness, he vanished into himself, leaving power in the hands of others. His uncles returned to court, eager once more to exploit the weakness of the crown. Factions began to form. The Duke of Orleans, Louis Charles's younger brother, stepped forward as a rival to the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold. Each sought control of the council, each cloaked their ambition in the language of loyalty. The kingdom itself became a chessboard on which the Glass King was the most fragile piece. And yet, amid this darkness, flashes of Charles's humanity broke through. There are records of him weeping after his outbursts, begging forgiveness of those he had frightened. In quieter moments, he would walk the gardens with his children, stroking their hair with a gentleness that seemed unshaken by his illness. Chroniclers note that his subjects, though fearful, did not abandon him entirely. Many pitied him, seeing in his broken mind a reflection of the kingdom's own suffering. The Queen, Isabeau, adapted with ruthless pragmatism. Publicly, she remained loyal, presenting herself as the guardian of her husband's dignity. Privately, she maneuvered to maintain influence, aligning at times with Burgundy, at times with Orleans, whichever served her interests best. Her reputation in later centuries would darken into scandal, painted as unfaithful, calculating, even treacherous. But in these years, her position was unenviable. She was bound to a husband who could no longer protect her, yet she bore the responsibility of a dynasty still in peril. Meanwhile, the people of France grew weary. Taxes rose once more as the dukes enriched themselves. Soldiers, unpaid, roamed the countryside like wolves. In Paris, murmurs grew louder. Was the Valois line cursed? Had God abandoned France? The king's madness seemed not just personal, but symbolic, an omen of a nation fractured, brittle, and vulnerable. The image of the Glass King captured this perfectly. Here was a monarch who could not bear the touch of his own subjects, who recoiled from embraces, who lived in fear of shattering. It was a haunting metaphor for France itself, a kingdom outwardly strong yet inwardly fragile, one strike away from breaking apart. By 1400, a new rhythm had settled. The court learned to function around the king's episodes. Councils continued, decrees were issued, wars were planned. But everything was provisional, tentative, as if balanced on shards. When Charles appeared lucid, there was celebration. When he relapsed, courtiers whispered prayers. The king no longer inspired confidence. He inspired dread. And yet, through all of this, Charles endured. He did not die young, as some whispered he would. He lived year after year, a monarch both present and absent, beloved and feared, pitied and ridiculed. The boy raised under golden ceilings, meant to restore his kingdom's glory, was now imprisoned in an invisible cage of his own mind. It was this paradox, fragile yet enduring, that defined him in the eyes of his contemporaries. To some, his madness was proof of divine wrath. To others, it was a reminder of human vulnerability. And to all, it was a warning. The crown itself was not immune to fracture. By the turn of the century, Charles VI had ceased to be the beloved king. He was, to his people, forever the Glass King. The madness of Charles VI did more than unseat a king. It unmoored an entire kingdom. Where once the monarch's word carried the weight of divine order, now there was only uncertainty. On days when Charles was lucid, decrees could be issued, alliances honored, and taxes collected. On days when madness consumed him, the court dissolved into chaos. Out of this void emerged two rivals who would shape the destiny of France for the next generation: Louis, Duke of Orleans, and Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Louis was Charles's younger brother, barely a teenager, when the king first showed signs of illness. By the early 1402nd, he had grown into a tall, handsome, and flamboyant prince. Chroniclers portray him as charming and witty, but also reckless, easily seduced by luxury, women, and intrigue. He carried himself with the confidence of a man certain he was destined for greatness, and in the absence of a functioning king, he pressed his claim to authority as lieutenant of the realm. Philip of Burgundy, by contrast, was deliberate, calculating, and immensely wealthy. His marriage to the heiress of Flanders had given him control of some of the richest territories in Europe, the thriving cities of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, where merchants dealt in cloth, spices, and precious metals. While Louis dazzled in Parisian salons, Philip commanded armies and treasuries that rivaled the crown itself. The two men despised each other. Louis saw Philip as a usurper, bleeding the crown for Burgundian interests. Philip viewed Louis as a dangerous libertine, unfit to govern. Their rivalry quickly escalated into a struggle not merely for influence but for survival. At the center of their conflict stood Queen Isabeau. Still, only in her 20s, she had already borne multiple children, including the Dauphin, the future heir. With Charles VI incapacitated, Isabeau's role grew critical, but she too became a pawn in the feud. Louis cultivated her favor, showering her with gifts, jewels, and whispered flattery. Rumors spread that the queen and the duke were lovers, though historians still debate the truth of such claims. Whether or not the affair was real, it provided Burgundy with the perfect weapon: to brand Orleans not only as an overreaching prince, but as a corrupter of the queen's virtue. Philip, meanwhile, positioned himself as the guardian of moral order. He styled himself protector of the king's dignity, casting his rival as a leech who drained the realm's coffers for personal pleasure. His propaganda was effective. In Paris, where economic hardship made Burgundian control of trade attractive, Philip gained a following among guildsmen and merchants. His men spread pamphlets painting Louis as a reckless spendthrift who squandered money on Italian astrologers and extravagant feasts while peasants starved. The court became a stage of whispered alliances and open hostility. On one side, the Orleanists, supporters of Louis, often younger nobles eager for patronage. On the other, the Burgundians, powerful magnates who saw in Philip's wealth and discipline a safer future. And above it all, the king drifted, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost, like a phantom presiding over his own undoing. The rivalry spilled into the streets. In Paris, students at the university debated not theology but which duke held rightful power. Guilds split along factional lines. In taverns, songs mocked Orleans' excesses or cursed Burgundian greed. Violence simmered beneath the surface. Amid this tension, Charles VI remained in his fragile world of glass. Chroniclers record that he often wandered the palace, muttering to himself or crouched in corners, refusing to move for fear of breaking. On some days, he did not recognize his own children. On others, he wept with tenderness at the sight of them. He no longer sat at the center of councils, he was the council's excuse, a hollow presence used by others to justify their decisions. The symbolism was devastating. A king who believed himself fragile as glass presided over a realm shattering into pieces. His body became the mirror of the kingdom's fate, cracked, fractured, one blow away from collapse. When Philip the Bold died in 1404, his son John the Fearless inherited both his power and his rivalry with Orleans. If Philip had been deliberate, John was ruthless. He wasted no time escalating the feud. In 1407, as tensions reached breaking point, assassins struck. On a cold November night in Paris, Duke Louis of Orleans was ambushed on a narrow street. His skull was split with an axe, his body hacked to pieces. The killers left him where he fell, a grotesque spectacle of political murder. The message was clear. Burgundy would not share power. Queen Isabeau, once rumored to be Louis's lover, was humiliated and cornered. Charles VI, too unstable to respond, was told of his brother's death only when he was deemed lucid enough. His reaction, if any, went unrecorded. France had entered a new phase of crisis civil war. The factions hardened into open conflict. The Armagnacs, loyal to the slain Orléans's heirs, and the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless. Paris became a battlefield of assassinations, riots, and purges. And at the heart of it, the crown sat hollow, worn by a king who could no longer even protect his own blood. The people of France, already battered by plague and English war, now faced the added torment of internal strife. Some blamed Isabeau, others cursed John the Fearless, still others whispered that God himself had abandoned the Valois line. But most returned again and again to the same image: their king, fragile and broken, unable to hold the realm together. In these years, Charles VI to be merely a mad king. He became the emblem of France's fracture, an entire nation trapped in the body of glass. By the dawn of the 15th century, France was a kingdom, bleeding from within. The assassination of Louis of Orléans in 1407 had torn open a wound that refused to heal. His supporters, the Armagnacs, rallied behind his widow and children, swearing vengeance against the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless. John, for his part, defended his deed with brazen confidence. He declared that Louis had been a tyrant and seducer, a danger to France's very soul, and that his death was an act of just deliverance. The court, already fractured by years of Charles VI's madness, now became a battlefield in miniature. Isabeau of Bavaria, the queen, maneuvered to preserve her power, shifting her allegiance between factions as circumstances demanded. When Burgundy seemed dominant, she leaned toward John. When the Armagnacs gained ground, she tilted the other way. To her enemies, she became a figure of scandal painted as promiscuous, corrupt, and self-serving. To her allies, she was merely surviving in a palace-turned-shark tank. Meanwhile, the king drifted ever further into fragility. By 1410, Charles VI had ceased to govern in any meaningful sense. Episodes of madness gripped him with cruel regularity. At times, he believed himself to be St. George, sent to fight dragons. At others, he insisted his body was made of glass and had to be wrapped in iron rods to prevent shattering. He could no longer distinguish friend from foe, child from stranger. On one occasion, when his son, the Dauphin, was brought before him, Charles recoiled as though confronted by a demon. The boy fled the chamber in tears. Thus, the kingdom was left to the competing ambitions of its factions. The Armagnacs, under the leadership of Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who married Louis of Orléans's daughter, pressed their claim through alliances with southern lords. The Burgundians, entrenched in Paris and the wealthy northern territories, wielded not only military strength but also the fervent support of guilds and students. Both sides proclaimed loyalty to the crown, but in practice they treated the king as little more than a broken emblem. Paris itself became the beating heart of this division. Streets once filled with merchants and pilgrims now echoed with riots and bloodshed. In 1413, the Cabotian Revolt, an uprising of radical guildsmen allied with the Burgundians, tore through the city. Armed mobs stormed the Hotel Saint-Paul, demanding reforms, lynching Armagnac supporters, and dragging corpses through the mud. Chroniclers describe the Seine running red, the city gates smeared with blood. In the midst of it all, Charles VI reportedly wandered the corridors of the palace, barefoot and vacant-eyed, whispering prayers to saints no one else could hear. The kingdom was not only divided but vulnerable. Across the Channel, England watched with hungry eyes. Henry IV, who had seized the English throne in 1399, saw opportunity in France's weakness. But it was his son, Henry V, crowned in 1413, who moved decisively. Young, ambitious, and martial, Henry sought glory through conquest. He revived English claims to the French crown and prepared for invasion. In 1415, his army landed in Normandy. They marched inland, devastating villages, while the Armagnacs and Burgundians bickered in Paris. A desperate effort was made to unite under the Valois banner. French nobles, clad in brilliant armor, gathered a massive host to confront Henry. Charles VI, too unstable to lead, remained absent. The Dauphin nominally presided, but true command fell to squabbling nobles. The confrontation came in October, near a small village called Agincourt. The French outnumbered the English 2-1, but the battlefield was narrow and sodden with autumn rain. French knights charged recklessly, bogged down in the mud, their heavy armor turning the field into a slaughterhouse. English longbowmen, planted behind sharpened stakes, rained arrows upon them. By day's end, thousands of French nobles lay dead counts, dukes, and knights who had once strutted proudly through Parisian halls. Among the fallen were some of the brightest names of the realm, cut down not by chivalric duels, but by mud, arrows, and exhaustion. The defeat at Agincourt was more than a military catastrophe. It was a psychic fracture. France, already riven by civil war, had now been humiliated by its ancient enemy. Chroniclers describe the despair that gripped the kingdom, church bells tolling funerals, widows draped in black, peasants whispering that God himself had turned against France. And where was the king? Charles VI, the man anointed to lead his people, was lost in his delusions. Some reports suggest he was told of Agincourt, but reacted with blank incomprehension, as though the words had no meaning. Others claim he wept, clutching his head, murmuring that it was all his fault. Whatever the truth, the image endured. While his realm bled, the king sat in a palace, fragile as glass, unable to hold a sword, unable even to hold his own sanity. For many, Charles's madness ceased to be a private tragedy and became a national symbol. His body, imagined as brittle glass, mirrored the fragility of France itself, cracked by factional strife, shattered by foreign invasion, its pieces scattered across the fields of Picardy. In the wake of Agincourt, France's enemies closed in. Henry V pressed deeper into Normandy. The Burgundians and Armagnacs, rather than uniting, sharpened their knives further. The Dauphin, though barely a man, faced impossible pressures. And above it all, the crown remained perched on the head of a king who could no longer even recognize his own children. The kingdom had entered its darkest hour. By the late 1412, France was staggering on the edge of collapse. The civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians had hardened into a blood feud, filling Parisian streets with executions and vengeance killings. The English, under Henry V, advanced steadily through Normandy, seizing towns with ruthless efficiency. Everywhere, the crown seemed absent. The King Charles VI sat in his chambers, alternately raving and silent, sometimes recognizing no one, sometimes clutching himself as though afraid his glass body might splinter. In 1419, the crisis reached a boiling point. The Dauphin Charles, son of the king, sought reconciliation with the Burgundians to resist the English. A meeting was arranged with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, on a bridge at Monarch. But the attempt at peace turned bloody. John was hacked to death in full view of the Dauphin's men. Whether premeditated or spontaneous, the murder destroyed any hope of unity. The Burgundians, in rage, swung decisively toward an alliance with England. The consequences were catastrophic. John's successor, Philip the Good, pledged himself to Henry V. Together, they pressed a claim more audacious than any in memory, that the crown of France did not belong to the Valois line at all, but to the English king. In 1420, in the city of Troyes, that claim was sealed. Chroniclers describe the atmosphere as tense, almost unreal. French envoys, weary of war and desperate for stability, sat across from English negotiators. Between them lay the wreckage of a kingdom, the memory of Agincourt, the ruins of Norman towns, the blood of assassinated dukes. At the center of the negotiation stood Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. By now, she was reviled by many of her subjects, accused of corruption, infidelity, and betrayal. But at Troyes, she wielded extraordinary influence. With her husband incapacitated, she represented the crown's will, or what was left of it. And she made a choice that would brand her name with infamy. She agreed to disinherit her own son, the Dauphin Charles, and recognize Henry V of England as the legitimate heir to the French throne. The king himself was present, though scarcely aware of what was happening. Witnesses said Charles VI, pale and frail, was led into the cathedral where the treaty was to be formalized. His eyes wandered, unfocused. Some claimed he muttered to himself about saints and demons. Others said he smiled vaguely, as if oblivious. When the document was placed before him, his hand shook so violently that clerks had to steady it. Still, he signed. The Treaty of Troyes declared that Henry V would marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and that their heirs would inherit not only England, but also France. The Dauphin, rightful heir under centuries of tradition, was stripped of his legitimacy. For many in France, it was the ultimate humiliation. a living king denying his own blood, handing his kingdom to a foreign power. Reactions were explosive. The Dauphin, enraged, denounced the treaty as illegitimate, claiming his mother had betrayed him. He fled south, establishing a rival court at Bourges, and declared himself the true defender of France. To his supporters, he was the only hope against English domination. To his enemies, he was a rebel prince, disowned by his father. Meanwhile, Henry V celebrated his triumph. Chroniclers describe his entry into Troyes as a conqueror welcomed not by swords but by signatures. He had achieved through diplomacy what generations of English kings had sought through blood. For him, the Valois crown was no longer a distant dream, but an imminent inheritance. And what of Charles VI, the man at the center of this seismic betrayal? He drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes believing himself in a different century, sometimes forgetting he was king at all. To some observers, this was divine justice, a monarch so broken that he could not even defend his own lineage. To others, it was tragedy, a man whose mind had betrayed him, leaving him powerless to resist the vultures around his throne. Symbolism clung to the event like a shadow. Here was the glass king, terrified of breaking, now watching his kingdom fracture beyond repair. His trembling signature on the treaty was like a crack running through a pane of stained glass, delicate, irreversible, fatal. The people of Paris reacted with bitterness. Many sided with Burgundy, embracing the English alliance as the price of order. But in the countryside, peasants cursed Isabeau and the Burgundians, rallying to the Dauphin's cause. Civil war deepened, now entangled with foreign conquest. The Treaty of Troyes, in effect, declared that France's monarchy had ended. The Valois were broken, the future belonged to the Plantagenets. Henry V, young and vigorous, seemed poised to unify two crowns and achieve what no English king before him had managed, to rule both sides of the Channel. Yet fate, always capricious, would not allow even Henry to escape its cruelty. Within 2 years of signing the treaty, the English king would be dead, struck down not by battle, but by sudden illness. His triumph at Troyes would leave behind an infant son, Henry VI, crowned king of both France and England, but too young to wield either throne. For the moment, however, the humiliation belonged entirely to Charles VI. He had lived to see his dynasty disinherited, his son branded a rebel, and his daughter handed to the enemy. The boy who had once been called Bien-Aimé the Beloved was now remembered as the monarch who surrendered France. As the ink dried on the Treaty of Troyes, the kingdom seemed shattered beyond repair. Its king was a shell of a man, its queen despised, its heirs divided, and its crown promised to a foreigner. France itself had become, like its sovereign, a body of glass splintered, fragile, and waiting for the final blow. After the Treaty of Troyes, Charles VI no longer resembled a ruler. He was little more than a shadow haunting the corridors of his own palaces. Officially, he remained King of France. His name was stamped on coins, read in prayers, invoked in decrees, but in reality, he was absent both from the affairs of state and from his own mind. The years 1420 to 1422 were the final chapter of his life, and they unfolded not as a reign, but as a long, slow eclipse. England and Burgundy tightened their hold on the north of France, enforcing the treaty that made Henry V heir to the French crown. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited yet defiant, ruled a splinter court in Bourges, gathering the loyalty of southern lords and stubborn loyalists. The kingdom was effectively divided in two, its unity shattered. And at the heart of this fractured realm sat a king who no longer knew what France was, or even who he was meant to be. Chroniclers paint a picture of eerie decline. Charles was often found wandering the corridors of the Hotel St. Paul or the Louvre. Barefoot, his hair unkempt, his robes disheveled. He muttered to himself in fragmented phrases, sometimes prayers, sometimes nonsense. On certain days, he refused food, convinced it was poisoned. On others, he devoured meals with animal-like hunger. Servants whispered that he would sit for hours, staring into mirrors, touching his face as if to reassure himself he was still whole. The delusion of glass never left him. He still feared sudden movements, still insisted his body might shatter if struck. Guards were instructed to keep distance, to move slowly around him. Sometimes he wrapped himself in blankets and sat rigid, trembling with fear of breaking. In a bitter irony, the very kingdom he ruled mirrored his delusion. Fractured, brittle, at constant risk of shattering into pieces. His wife, Isabeau, still held authority as regent in Paris, but she too was despised. Pamphlets spread by Armagnac loyalists accused her of adultery, corruption, even witchcraft. In the eyes of many, she was the betrayer who had signed away France's crown at Troyes. Her presence offered no comfort to the king. He often recoiled from her as if she were a stranger. Their relationship, strained for decades, was now little more than an empty formality. In these years, it was not unusual for Charles to forget he was king altogether. On some days, he insisted he was a monk and demanded to be taken to a monastery. On others, he believed he was dead, wandering the halls as if searching for his own tomb. There are accounts of him speaking to invisible figures, holding conversations with saints or ancestors no one else could see. The court grew accustomed to such scenes, but for those who witnessed them, they remained unsettling proof that their sovereign had slipped into another world. Meanwhile, the political landscape grew darker. In 1421, Henry V and Catherine of Valois, Charles's daughter, had a son, Henry of Windsor. By the treaty's terms, this infant was now heir to both England and France. For the Burgundians, this was triumph. For the Armagnacs and the Dauphin, it was proof of treachery. But for Charles VI, it is doubtful he even understood. When told of his grandson's birth, some say he smiled vaguely and murmured blessings. Others claim he looked confused, asking whether the child was his own. Tragedy struck the following year. In August 1422, Henry V died suddenly at the age of 35, felled by illness in France at the height of his power. The news rocked Europe. The conqueror of Agincourt, the man who had bent France to his will, was gone. Yet his legacy remained. His infant son, Henry VI, was proclaimed king of both England and France. 2 months later, on the 21st of October, Charles VI himself died in Paris. He was 53 years old. Chroniclers say his death was quiet, almost unnoticed amid the storm of war. He had been ill for weeks, wasting away in his chambers, tended by priests and a handful of loyal attendants. No grand ceremony marked his passing. For many, it felt as though he had died years before, his body simply lingering after his mind had departed. Paris did not erupt in mourning. There were no great laments, no outpourings of grief. Instead, the city seemed to exhale with weary indifference. The king who had once been called Bien-Aimé the Beloved was now remembered as Le Roi Fou, the Mad King. His reign had lasted more than 40 years, yet most of those years had been consumed by delusion, factional strife, and national humiliation. His funeral procession moved through the streets with little ceremony. The people watched, silent, as the body of their king passed by. Some pitied him, others cursed him, many simply looked away. He was laid to rest in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, among the kings of France, but his memory carried no grandeur. The aftermath was chaos. The infant Henry VI was proclaimed king of both France and England in Paris, upheld by the Burgundians. In the south, the Dauphin Charles declared himself rightful king, dismissing the Treaty of Troyes as void. 2 kings, 2 courts, 1 fractured realm. The war would continue, bloodier than before, until a young peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc would rise to rally the French under the banner of the Dauphin. But for Charles VI, the story had ended. He had entered the world as a golden heir, born under painted ceilings and raised in the light of scholars. He had once been celebrated as a beloved king, a symbol of renewal. Yet he left the world as a broken shadow, a man who believed himself made of glass, a monarch remembered not for triumphs but for fractures. In his death, as in his life, he embodied the fragility of France itself, brilliant and powerful in appearance, but brittle, splintered, and perilously close to shattering. When Charles VI of France died on the 21st of October 1422, there was no sense of a great chapter closing, only the weary resignation of a kingdom that had long since moved beyond him. His reign had lasted more than 4 decades. Yet in those years, France had been bled by plague, fractured by civil war, and humiliated by foreign invasion. A reign that should have been remembered for strength and restoration was instead remembered for fragility, delusion, and betrayal. He had begun as Charles Bien-Aimé, the beloved king, but history would record him as Le Roi Fou the Mad King, or, more hauntingly, the Glass King. His funeral reflected that strange ambivalence. The procession carried him to Saint-Denis, traditional resting place of French kings, but the ceremony was muted, stripped of grandeur. Chroniclers noted the silence of the crowd. Some bowed their heads in pity, others muttered curses under their breath. There were no songs of mourning, no widespread grief. Charles had lived too long in madness, too far removed from his people to inspire love at his end. In death, as in life, he seemed absent, less a sovereign than a ghost carried to its grave. Yet if Charles himself was forgotten, his reign would not be. It had reshaped the very fabric of France. The civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians, ignited during his illness, had left wounds that would fester for decades. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in his name, had handed France's crown to England and disinherited his own son, creating two rival monarchies in one land. And the symbolism of his madness, the belief that his body was made of glass, had become an allegory for the fragility of kingship itself. For contemporaries, Charles's affliction was both terrifying and mysterious. Physicians of the day spoke of melancholy humors, of hot blood that boiled the brain. Priests warned of demonic possession. Ordinary people whispered that it was punishment from God for the sins of the Valois line. Modern historians have speculated about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a hereditary mental illness inherited from his mother's Bourbon family. But whatever the diagnosis, the lived experience was far more immediate. A king who could not be touched, who hid behind iron supports, who screamed at his own children, who wandered the palace like a soul lost between worlds. And France reflected its sovereign. The kingdom itself seemed made of glass, cracked by factionalism, vulnerable to shattering under the weight of war. The symbolism was too powerful to ignore. Chroniclers writing decades later would still recall the eerie image of a monarch terrified of breaking, even as his kingdom splintered around him. Yet Charles's death also marked a beginning. His son, the disinherited Dauphin Charles, immediately claimed the crown as Charles VII. For years, he had been dismissed as a king of Bourges, ruling only a fragment of southern France, while Paris and the north obeyed the infant Henry VI of England. But from the ashes of his father's shattered reign, he would eventually rebuild. The unlikely appearance of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed visions from God, would rally French arms, lift sieges, and restore faith in the Valois cause. In this sense, Charles VI's legacy was paradoxical. His failure created the crucible in which his son's redemption and France's survival were forged. To later historians, Charles VI stands as one of the most tragic figures of medieval monarchy. He was not a tyrant, nor a villain, nor a warmonger. By many accounts, he was gentle, intelligent, even compassionate in his lucid years, but his mind betrayed him. And because a king's body and mind were inseparable from the state itself, his madness became France's madness. In an age when the crown was sacred, when the king's very touch was believed to heal disease, to see a monarch broken in spirit was to see the divine order itself collapse. His epithet, the Glass King, has endured not only because of his delusion, but because of what it revealed about power. Glass is beautiful, transparent, capable of catching the light in dazzling colors when shaped into windows. But it is also fragile, easily shattered by force. Charles VI embodied both sides of that material. In youth, he was a radiant hope, a beloved sovereign who seemed to shine with promise. In adulthood, he splintered, each break leaving the kingdom weaker, until little remained but shards. And yet even shards catch the light. To his people, there were still moments when he appeared radiant, playing with his children, granting mercy to prisoners, walking in gardens in fleeting lucidity. These glimpses reminded them of what might have been and of how cruel fortune had been to both king and country. In the centuries that followed, his reign was remembered as a cautionary tale. Poets invoked him as a symbol of the fallibility of kings, theologians as proof that divine favor could vanish, historians as a case study in the dangers of weak monarchy. For physicians and scholars of the mind, his delusion became a fascinating window into the history of mental illness. Even today, the glass delusion is cited in psychological literature, with Charles VI as its most famous sufferer. So what remains of the Glass King? Perhaps only this: the reminder that crowns do not make men invincible. Power does not insulate the human mind from breaking. A king may be anointed with holy oil, wrapped in silks, and seated beneath golden ceilings, yet still tremble like the rest of us. Charles VI's reign exposed the raw truth of monarchy, not as divine perfection, but as human vulnerability. When the stone of his tomb settled at Saint-Denis, France was already moving on. The war continued, bloodier than ever. 2 kings claimed 1 crown, and yet, in the silence of his burial, one could almost imagine the whisper of glass, fragile, fractured, and forever part of France's memory.